Welcome to Watches with Dennis, and today I wanted to do a brief conversation about just exploring whether or not we think Omega and Cartier could ever actually dethrone Rolex. And by dethrone, what I mean is, as most of us are aware, Morgan Stanley, every year there's a report looking at the Swiss watch industry, and their 2024 report, which looks back at 2023, found that Rolex is at that top of that pile in terms of the retail market share. Rolex is over 30% now of the Swiss watch industry, and Cartier and Omega are in number 2 and number 3's positions respectively, each of them being about 7.5% of that market share. So this begs the question, is there any way either of those two brands, or any other brand, but really they're the two closest, could ever actually displace Rolex and be the number 1 market share of the Swiss industry? The short answer is yes, but almost no. And the reason for that is just the nature of how it's all structured. So let's consider Cartier really quickly. Well, Cartier is known mostly as a jewelry brand. They have done watches for a really long time. I think the reason why Cartier is so high up on this list, and they used to actually be number 3 to Omega. It's only been more recently that they moved up into the number 2 position, though it is very close, at least as of 2023. First, Cartier, because of its jewelry bona fides, is able to appeal to a lot of women with watches. And that's not something a lot of watch brands do very well. And so a lot of that market share is likely targeting women who are interested in the brand Cartier already because of the jewelry side of things. The second thing is they don't do a lot of traditional watches. You could probably argue they don't really do any traditional looking watches. A lot of square shapes, a lot of rectangles. That sort of market is just sort of how they go because, again, it's mostly a jewelry brand. So I think they would actually have the hardest time. I just don't think, given the nature of the company, Cartier is in any way positioned to become the number 1 leader of Swiss watchmaking. So I think they're kind of ruled out, short of some major change up in how they do business. So that leaves Omega. The problem that Omega has is it should be the competitor. In fact, decades ago, it was the competitor. And with watch collectors, it is the one that would be the most likely to achieve it because Omega is first and foremost a watch manufacturer, just like Rolex is. I think the big difference, though, is, well, Rolex has very much leaned into the staying true to what their designs used to look like, just iterating. Omega's more known for events or things that their watches are tied to, not the watches themselves. A case in point would be the Seamaster, a watch that I don't think very many people, broadly speaking, thought anything about until the 1990s and the marketing tie-in with James Bond and Pierce Brosnan, and that relationship has continued on since then, and it's touched a few other models like Planet Ocean and such. But the Seamaster is so closely associated with James Bond now, that's what moves the watches for Omega, or at least that's what I think moves the watches for Omega. The problem is, James Bond as a franchise is not consistent in the sense that we don't always have James Bond movies. In fact, we've already seen the last Daniel Craig movie, and at this point, we don't even know who's going to play James Bond in a future film. So there's no real easy way to market it. They're still trying. They're still doing James Bond tie-ins with watches. But every year we move further away from the last film, the more nostalgic that sort of gets, but also the less ever-present in the mind it gets. I think the other example that's even more clear is the Moonwatch or the Speedmaster Professional. That horse is beaten constantly by Omega. But here's the problem with the moon landing. When was the last time we had anyone on the moon? It was 1972. That was before I was born, and I'm old. So it's nostalgic. It was a major event, but nothing's really happening, or it sure doesn't feel like anything's happening. So they're just going back and beating the same drum over and over, and they're iterating on the Moonwatch with new themes, new callbacks to missions, and all of that. And that'll appeal to Moonwatch collectors, but I don't see how it really drives them forward. And I think that shows in terms of their market share. But the biggest reason why Rolex likely can't be dethroned would be Rolex would have to screw it up. Rolex would have to dethrone itself. It's not that Omega or Cartier could actually take the crown away from them. Rolex plays it very safe. They continue to do a lot of advertising, but they already have this reputation as the watch you get to celebrate events. The biggest thing that could displace them, and why I think they're keenly aware of this and why they have been pushing up their production numbers on watches, and why we are hearing that they're trying to onboard more factories, is the inability to get the watch. Now, I've talked at length on other videos about where I think this is a problem. It's only a problem in part, but That's the part that I think Rolex is keenly aware of. Rolex wants to make more money. They turn out more and more iterations of precious metal watches. Totally fine. They'll always stay in steel if they want to keep the crown at the top of this throne. And that's because for a lot of people, they will never afford a new in-box precious metal Rolex. For a lot of people, their retirement watch could very well be a Datejust, or an Oyster Perpetual, or a Submariner, not a day date. So that's why I think Rolex is ensuring that they continue to do a lot of production in those realms. The problem comes up with what we saw like during the pandemic, where you can't even walk in and buy an Oyster Perpetual. You have to be on a wait list. That is not Rolex's model. Rolex's model can allow wait lists. It's reasonable to think they might be perfectly happy saying, like they did well before the pandemic, that it's a wait list to get a Daytona, that's a Grail piece. Maybe you have to wait a little bit for a GMT Master 2. It is not okay to have to wait for Oyster Perpetuals and Datejusts. And that's where I think they're trying to alleviate that, because long term, that could be an opportunity where Omega or perhaps Cartier could move in more aggressively and take up space. Because it doesn't benefit Rolex for me to walk into an authorized dealer. And I just did this the other day. I went to not my closest authorized dealer. I went a little bit further up in the region and went to one which was very blunt about saying, if you want this Submariner, Dennis, you'll move up the list a lot quicker if you buy some other things from us. They didn't say other Rolex. They talked Grand Seiko, they talked Omega, because they were dealing in those watches. Rolex doesn't benefit when an authorized dealer sells an Omega watch. So that doesn't help Rolex in any way. I think they want to see it much more like what you get with Audemars Piguet or a Lange & Söhne, where there are plenty of watches that you can start with, and buying those maybe is necessary to move up into some of the other pieces. I think Rolex would be happy with that model, but not a model where everything is on a wait list. So we already know they're trying to fix this, however, and that's about the only thing I can think of, short of disastrously mismanaging the company or just going out of business for no foreseeable reason, that Rolex would ever fall from the number one spot on this retail market share of the Swiss industry. But those are my thoughts. Please share yours below in the comment section. I'd like to know what you think. Especially if you have ideas on ways that Cartier, Omega, or maybe some other brand could possibly move up into the number one position, because I'm at a loss to think of any realistic model where that could happen. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like. It does help my channel out. Click subscribe if you want to be automatically notified when I release new videos. And otherwise, I'll talk to you all on the next one. Take care.